So, good morning, everyone. My name's Tim. I'm an alcoholic. Thank you for being here with me today. And we're on concept 10. So, let's read the UK one for fun. Every service responsibility should be matched by an equal service authority, the scope of such authority to be always well defined, whether by tradition, by resolution, by specific job description, by appropriate charters, or by legal instruments. There's an awful lot on this concept, so bear with me, okay? Um, so if we're going to talk about responsibility and authority, we need to define them. People get this one blurred because they haven't got a clear definition of what the two terms mean. So responsibility, I think, is having you've got a job to do. You're accountable for the results. Because you're going to be accountable for the results, you work hard, you do things properly, you're diligent, and you exercise all of the other aspects of leadership. So responsibility, it's having a job to do, getting it done, and then reporting back. Authority is about power and resources. So if you're given a job to do, you need some decision-making power. If you're given a shop to run, you have to have the power to hire people, to fire people, to decide when to open, to decide what to put on the shelves, blah, blah, blah. You've got to have that. Without that decision-making authority, the job of running the shop can't be done by you. You also need resources. You need money, you need people, you need materials, and you need equipment. So responsibility and authority go together. So responsibility is having a job, and then authority is decision-making power and resources. The basic principle here with responsibility, actually there are several basic principles in concept 10. The first one is that if I've got a job to do, I have to be accountable for the results. And this is really an extension of concept 3. So the loop in concept 3, right of decision, is you ask for help if necessary. If you're given something to do, you consult who needs to be consulted, you act, and then you report back. Because you know you're going to be accountable, it encourages responsible behaviour. And I know, as having done public information and similar roles, knowing that I have to report back on what I've done to like 30 or 40 people, it's really embarrassing if you haven't done anything, or if you've done it badly, or if you've acted outside your scope or whatever. So it makes you, knowledge that you're going to have to be accountable makes you act responsibly. Ideally, at any rate. Because the 4 measures that they've got against you, if you do something wrong, censure, redirection, reorganization, and replacement, are not pleasant. So people want to avoid those so that they pay Caesar Caesar's coin. So if you want to keep the job, you have to do it properly. If you want to keep your reputation, you have to do the job properly. And who do you report back to? Whoever gave you the job. If Region gives you a job to do, you're reporting back to Region. If a literature committee is given a job by the board, it's accountable not to the fellowship, but to the board. They're the ones who gave them the job to do. Sometimes people try and insert themselves in that process and contact the literature committee directly, and it's not really appropriate. So this principle of authority and responsibility going together, it really underlies all of the other concepts. And there are some concepts which are about structure, like 1 and 2 and 6 and 7 and 8. And then there are other ones which are about how the job gets done. So you've got 3 and 4 and 5 and 9 and 10. 11 is a bit of a mishmash, and 12 is some general principles too. And let me have a look. So the purpose of all of this, why are we even here talking about the concepts? Why do the concepts even exist? It's to get things done, and the 3 parameters for doing something well, according to I think I get this from the introduction to Bill W.'s essays on the concept. He talks about effectiveness and efficiency. And then there's that wonderful phrase in the big book, brotherly and harmonious action. And I think together those produce your three parameters: effectiveness, efficiency, and harmoniously. Uh, harmony. You want to get it done well, you want to get it done quickly and with minimal use of resources, and you want to get it done without anyone needing to be pushed downstairs. That's harmony. Uh, and this concept also therefore prevents the opposite of those. What's the opposite of those? Ineffectiveness, inefficiency, conflict, and confusion. And so now this is, I think, interesting. Well, to me anyway. I never know if anything's interesting to anyone else. Uh, but if ever you've got a situation where something is ineffective in AA, or inefficient, or there is conflict, or there is confusion, very often there is a concept 10 issue, because lines of responsibility and authority are blurred somehow. Now here's this is rather an esoteric idea in this concept, so bear with me on this one. Concept 1 says that the final responsibility and ultimate authority rests with the collective consciousness of the fellowship as a whole, collective conscience of the fellowship as a whole. But some of that authority and responsibility keeps getting delegated, and we call this delegated authority and delegated responsibility. However, this is the esoteric point. The esoteric point is that, let's say you're given a job by let's say you're the public information officer of City Intergroup, the role which I did for a while. Although final responsibility and ultimate authority resides with, God and the fellowship, it's no good invoking that at the intergroup meeting saying, well, I'm not accountable to you, I'm accountable to God. And then say, well, stuff you, because like God overrides you, so I'm responsible to God. No. You treat the layer above you in the actual world as being the final as holding final responsibility and ultimate authority, even though we know that it's the fellowship behind that and it's God behind that. In practice, the layer above, that they're the ones with the final decision. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a safety valve, and the safety valve is concept 5, where you can this right of appeal, where if something awful is happening, you can leapfrog, but only if something really awful is happening, and it's very rare. So the essay talks about final responsibility and ultimate authority. It sort of trickles down through the fellowship, leaving a trace at each level. So there are points of final responsibility and authority all the way through the fellowship. Now the next question is why responsibility and authority need to be delegated. Why responsibility needs to be delegated is pretty clear. If you're in your little group in Aberdeen and you want to publish a book, you can't. You need to delegate the job of doing that. That's the responsibility and you delegate it down through the structure, and eventually the literature committee publishes the book. Now, with authority being delegated, this is another slightly esoteric point, but I think it's a real one. If each layer holds all of the authority for itself, it becomes the little czar. I think it uses that phrase in the concept essays. It becomes the little czar of the layer below. Now, if you delegate some of that authority, let's say the intergroup delegates some of its decision-making authority to the public information officer, who can then act as they see fit in the role, the intergroup is no longer the little czar of the layer below. There's a little bit of a collaboration going on. So some of the authority gets delegated down to the public information officer, and the public information officer is part of the decision-making layer above. That's right of participation. So you don't have each layer simply being the czar of the layer below, wagging its finger and telling people off and telling them what to do. Authority is being delegated the whole time. Whenever a job is delegated, some authority is delegated. And remember, authority, if you want a quick way of remembering authority, it's decision-making power plus resources. Let's see what else we've got. Okay, so we've got to look at where this goes wrong. And there are lots of ways in which this goes wrong. The first way is when you've got what we can call responsibility without authority. That means you're trying to get a job done, you're trying to do something, but no one told you to do it. This is called going rogue. And a good example is where someone undertakes major public information activities without the authority of the fellowship. Or for instance, you're in a public information role and you exceed your scope. You try to go national on something because you get a contact, and instead of handing it to the national public information people, you try and handle it yourself. And the problem here is it's the tail wagging the dog. But it's pretty clear why that's a really bad idea. If you don't have the authority to speak on behalf of the whole fellowship, but you start doing so, there's no proper oversight. So that's simple. That's responsibility without authority. You've got a reverse problem, which is authority without responsibility. And this is where people, I'm sure you've never seen this, where people try to exercise power, but they haven't got a job to do. They're just trying to exercise power somehow. And I've got two good examples of this. The first one is where some groups in the UK posed a question to conference about, in Great Britain rather, posed a question to conference about atheist and agnostic literature. And they wanted an atheist and agnostic pamphlet. This is a very, very good idea. So they put it to conference, and conference said, we think this is a terribly good idea, but we're going to delegate this responsibility to the Literature Committee. And the Literature Committee then publishes the draft pamphlet, and the whole fellowship gets to look at it. Now, the whole fellowship, you go into any of the, 4,500, 5,000 groups in Great Britain. You go into any of those and you say, hands up who's an agnostic or an atheist. Well, probably half the hands in the room, 3/4 of the hands in the room. So there are atheists and agnostics everywhere. And it's each group's job to give its feedback. So 4,500, 5,000 groups have got their little job at this point is to give their feedback. But there are a couple of groups who were specifically atheist and agnostic groups who said, no. We're the atheist and agnostic group, so we're going to start writing to the Literature Committee, telling them how they've got it wrong and how we think they ought to be doing it. Now, you're absolutely fine to have groups are being asked for their opinion, but there are channels for doing this. The atheist and agnostic group's feedback on that pamphlet goes into the pot along with the feedback from all of the other groups. There's no special hotline just because you raise a question which then gets put to conference and turns into a recommendation. You lose ownership of that. As soon as it is taken up by the fellowship as a whole, it's not your question. It's the fellowship's question. You have no authority beyond your capacity as part of the worldwide fellowship of AA, nationwide fellowship of AA. The second situation And there are lots, but here's just a second example. Authority without responsibility. This is where you try to make decisions or exercise power which is not your own. Now, the General Service Board in Great Britain is bound by UK law. This is all good. And in this country, we have something called safeguarding law, which is designed to safeguard vulnerable individuals against abuse. And this is the law. And as a charity, the General Service Board and its various offices are bound by this law. The groups have got nothing to do with charity law. They're not charities. The Charities Commission in Great Britain, its view, and this is enshrined, I'm not making this up, this is enshrined, I'm not making anything up, hopefully, but anyway, it's enshrined in the handbooks for service and structure in Great Britain, that the Charities Commission, as long as groups and intergroups and regions do not incorporate, do what you want, outside the scope of the Charity Commission's authority. Right, so far so good. Now, safeguarding law is of general application, but it needs to be applied very strictly by charities. So the Charities Commission is very tough on charities and how they apply safeguarding law. But AA groups are unincorporated, informal collections of people essentially engaging in a private endeavour of their own. And there are obligations under safeguarding law I'm given to understand about how people behave generally when they discover cases of abuse or harm or whatever. But the General Service Board issued some effectively directives. How did we know it was a directive? It kept using the word must, what groups must do. Directives to groups on how to apply safeguarding law. And one of the directives was that if there are meetings with newcomers of any sort, these have to be recorded. The group has to record these. Presumably the group secretary, who's the administrative officer of the group, would have to implement this. Now, I think the intention behind it was to keep some record of formal 12th stepping, which comes through the telephone office and gets passed out to individuals. I think that's probably what it was about. But the way it was worded was basically meetings with newcomers need to be recorded. Now, if you take this at its word, that means whenever an AA member has a telephone call, a text message, or meets physically someone who is under a year sober, this needs to be documented with names, telephone numbers, location, and I don't know, content maybe. And then this information will need to be passed to the group secretary, who then records it in a great big ledger. That's on the face of it, that is how you would implement. What does recording meetings with newcomers mean? I mean, incidentally, it's so badly worded. Someone who's not yet a member of AA would not be covered by this, because what is a newcomer? A newcomer is someone who's a non-AA members are not newcomers. Someone who hasn't yet decided to join AA, who's being 12th stepped, is not a newcomer. They're a potential newcomer. They're a potential prospect for AA. So here we're given a system where the people we're supposed to protect, which is the vulnerable potential AA members, are not covered by this, but we've got to, in a sort of Stalinist fashion, catalogue. And what's the secretary supposed to do with this information? Now, we posed this along with, a gazillion other questions to the General Service Office, a General Service Board, and we were told on 2 occasions that they weren't going to answer the questions. I mean, the directive itself had this line at the bottom saying, please contact us if you have further questions. We pose questions, nothing. It's like a year later or 2 years later now, nothing. So this is a very good example of the General Service Board is not responsible for the results of a group essentially saying to its members, if you want to be a member of this group, every time you have any kind of contact with someone else who is in the room, or it's even any member of AA. Like if you have contact with a member of AA who is under a year sober in another country, does that count? I mean, you have to tell us. Now, the General Service Board is not responsible for that. They're not carrying the can for that decision, but they're exercising the power. They're saying, you must do this or else. And that's a perfect example of trying to exercise power, so decision-making authority, but you're not responsible for implementing it. You're not responsible for doing the job. You're not carrying the can for the consequences, but you're still exercising the power. Disaster. Anyway, the situation's moved on, and who knows what's going to happen with that now. But that's an example of where Concept 10 was in my view, grossly breached. And there's another uh, instance of, so you've got responsibility without authority, and then you've got authority without responsibility. There's another situation where I'd call it a mismatch of authority and responsibility. And so this is where the other two examples or sets of examples were about situations where people are not staying in their lane at all. What I'm about to talk about is where you've got legitimate delegation going on, except it gets delegated badly. So typically, the way this works is you delegate responsibility, you delegate a job to someone, but you don't give them the authority to get on with it properly. And this is again very common in AA. So the higher level retains the authority but delegates the responsibility. The lower level, the servant, can't do the job because they're not given any power, they're not given any decision-making authority, and they can't really be held accountable. And the whole process stalls because whatever decisions are made at the higher level can't be implemented because they haven't delegated the power along with the job to do. And my best example of this is, I think I mentioned this before, where the board authorized one of its subcommittees to produce a poster, and the poster that the subcommittee came up with had to be authorized by the board before going to the fellowship. Fine. Except whenever a draft poster went to the board, someone on the board objected, some of the other members got spooked, and it got rejected. Now, it didn't get rejected with this is exactly what you need to do, and said, no, we don't like this, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so the people designing the poster were like, this is like pinning the tail on the donkey. It's only if the donkey makes a donkey noise that you know that, you've pinned the tail in the right place. So we weren't given the power to actually produce the poster we needed to produce because we weren't given the proper resources to do it. It was just blocked and blocked and blocked. Eventually, it got through. And what you end up is with buck passing. So the higher level is blaming the lower level for not getting the job done, and the lower level is blaming the higher level for not giving them the power to do it. So that's where things go wrong. A little bit more on defining responsibility and authority. So responsibility, this is essentially, we talked a little bit about it earlier, but the question is, who's going to do what? So if you're dividing up work in your group, all the service positions, who is responsible for what job? That's the core of responsibility. Who makes decisions about what? So which decisions are made by the group, which decisions are made by the officer, and who has what resources to play with? So the literature person, do they need to, I mean, there are groups, this is very common. There are groups where the full literature order needs to be reviewed by the group before being approved. And that's the standard, actually. So, that the literature person says, well, can we, I'm going to order 7 meeting lists and 2 pamphlets of this and 4 pamphlets. Is that all right with everyone? And then everyone has their little view on how, well, maybe we should have like 2 less big books and 1 more small big books, and maybe nightmare. Just give them a check. Say you can spend 50 quid, knock yourself out, lean towards getting big books and meeting lists. But that's what, when you're defining responsibility, this is part of the job of Concept 10, is defining responsibility. Who's going to do what? Who makes what decisions? Who has what resources? And what happens if this isn't decided, if the responsibility and authority is not decided? As I said earlier, you've got the confusion. If everyone thinks they're deciding on something or no one thinks they're deciding on something, you've got conflict if two different groups, if the officer thinks if the secretary who's choosing the speakers thinks they're in charge of choosing the speakers, but the group says, the group thinks it has a right of veto over every single speaker and starts to complain about it. That's a good example of where you've got a conflict, where ostensibly the group gives the speaker finder the authority to choose the speakers, but then tries to act as though it's retained that and veto every time they don't like one of the speakers. What else? So it says, where does this authority come from? So I'm going to read the long form again. Every service responsibility should be matched by an equal service authority, the scope of such authority to be always well defined, whether by tradition, by resolution, by specific job description, or by appropriate charters and bylaws. So, tradition. How is responsibility and authority defined by tradition? Tradition is really the collective memory of how things are done. But the trouble is, this can change easily over time and can be unreliable. Most groups in AA do not record decisions which are made, which are supposed to have like a long-term tail, which is supposed to be applied, in perpetuity. This is how this group operates. Like, we want our treasurer to be more than 2 years sober and to be in employment or to have some form of permanent income. Most groups don't record that. They make the decision and then gradually it gets forgotten. So if you've got a tradition in a group for how things are done or in any other entity, write it down, put it in the folder, and have this as like permanent standing decisions, permanent standing policies of a group. I've seen it work very well for groups to have general procedures and policies. So like lengths of sobriety, that kind of thing. What the group purpose is. To have that written down as a sort of formal document, which then gets put out to the whole group once a month so new people can see what the group policies and procedures are. And then to do the same with like the practical stuff. So if you're the T person, this is how you do the job. Where else does this come from? So it talks about tradition, resolution, specific job description, and appropriate charter or legal instrument. So resolutions, that's basically decisions. So you've either got ad hoc decisions or you've got decisions in perpetuity. And I remember at London Region North, what they used to do is whenever a decision was made, it went into the minutes of the meeting at which it was made, obviously. But anything with longer term impact would go into a separate document. And that was super helpful. So always record decisions made at business meetings or at group conferences, and then keep the long-term ones in a separate copy those across to a separate document. Job description. So even at a small group, it's really helpful to have a job description for each role in the room, and that gets updated by the outgoing incumbent when they leave. So the new person coming in has got a clear sense of what the job is. It's written down, plus they get a formal handover. We've also got manuals and handbooks. Actually, there's two handbooks now, the service handbook and the structure handbook. It talks about does it talk about terms of reference? It doesn't, but in the subcommittees, the national subcommittees here, which are subcommittees to the board. They have their own terms of reference which set out the authority and responsibility. And then at the General Service Office, all the people who are employed have got their own job descriptions. The charter, the conference has got its charter, and the board, being an incorporated entity, is, I think it's a memorandum and articles of association. So those are the different examples of where um, uh, responsibility and authority gets defined. But I think the key principle is, if you make a decision, write it down, because no one will remember. Even tomorrow, no one will remember. You know, what did we vote? Have you ever had a discussion at a meeting? What did we agree last week? No one can agree what they agreed. um, and there's a little checklist for if you're going to define authority and responsibility, a checklist to run through to make sure everything is covered. You've got the content. What is the job you want someone to do? Deliverables. What do you want them to deliver and by when? All the schedules, timelines, deadlines, how much time people are expected to expend on a role. Resources, how much money you're going to give them, how many volunteers they're going to be allocated. The scope of decision-making authority. So what do they get to decide themselves, and what do they need to push up to the level above? What do they need to refer upwards for decisions? Stakeholders for the purposes of consultation. So who else you need to keep informed. A good example is if you're doing public information work in AA, copy your minutes and invite to your meetings the public information officers who are in the neighbouring areas, so they know what is going on their doorstep, and they sometimes need to be consulted on stuff, particularly as our boundaries don't match administrative boundaries of whatever city or county or territory we're in. So you always have to consult the people around you, but you need to know who they are. It's very helpful when you've got a role to know who the elder statesmen are. So basically to have a list of people that can be gone to for assistance or questions. London Region North did this for a while. I don't think it was kept up, where there was a list of former members of London Region North who could be gone to ask questions, to get extra guidance. And also to define what records people should keep and how they should report back. Most people, God bless them, aren't natural record keepers. I know all of you are, but there are some people, you need to know there are some people who are not. So you need to tell them, like in a public information role, write down everything you do. Who you contacted, what was the organization, what was the name, what was the telephone number, what was the email address, what did you say to them, what did they say back, what was agreed, who was going to follow this up, all of those things. There's nothing worse than coming into a role where the person did not keep records of who they contacted and what they did. Another principle with this delegation of authority and responsibility is there's always an emergency veto available to the level which delegated some authority. And a good example is where you've got a conference or a convention, which is, let's say, being sponsored by an intergroup or a region, and it starts to go south. And although a huge amount of authority and responsibility is delegated, the higher authority can pull rank if necessary to replace people, to take charge, to redirect what's going to happen. And when does this happen? It either happens if the lower level to which authority is delegated is basically not getting its job done, or has gone rogue, is acting outside the scope of its authority. So I've got a worked example here. Let me just check. Yeah, a worked example of where Um, authority and responsibility have to go together, and where they don't, you've got a terrible problem. Okay, so let's say you're the chair, let's say you're in a region, and the region sets up a little committee to run a workshop, a service workshop, say. That little regional subcommittee has got a chair. Now, and this is an example of the override. This is what this is an example of. That chair must have final decision. Now, if you've ever run a workshop, it takes a lot of people doing a lot of different things, practical things and organizational things, and writing scripts and finding volunteers and training them and all of those things. Fine. So that chair is delegating onwards all sorts of authority and responsibility to various parts of the workshop, various aspects of the workshop. And a good chair will observe the democratic principle from concept 12 and right of participation, concept 4, which means he or she is not the dictator of this subcommittee. It means everyone on the subcommittee is, when you've got major decisions, the whole subcommittee is involved, everyone is part of those major decisions. Great. But the chair has effective right of veto or casting vote, or the right to override any individual member of the subcommittee, or even the whole subcommittee. There's a big difference between a committee where the chair is elected by the committee and a committee where the chair is elected by the layer above. So when you go to intergroup, your chair is elected by the people at the intergroup. If they don't like the chair, they get rid of the chair. If you've got a subcommittee of region, that committee can't get rid of the chair because it didn't put the chair in place. He or she put them in place. The chair can only be removed by the layer above. Now, if there's mutiny, people can leapfrog, go to the region and say, we've got a joker here, you need to get rid of him. And then they listen and they get rid of him. But that it can't get rid of its chair directly. It has to go round and above, and then from down the person gets removed. So the chair has veto. This is an actual situation I'm going to present. Someone on the workshop committee decided they wanted to replace the MC of the workshop. Now, there'd been an MC put in place like 2 months earlier, fully trained up, understood everything that was happening, had written the scripts, had prepared the scripts, was prepared for all of the different types of intervention. One of the committee members, who was in charge of that part of the workshop, had the bright idea at the last minute, like an hour before it started. I think we should replace them with this other person who I think will be a more suitable MC. They had to be overridden. They did not like being overridden. I wouldn't have liked being overridden. I understand that. But the reason why is that the chair of that workshop, let's say it had all gone wrong. You put in a new MC at the last minute. The whole thing is chaos. The chair, as the chair of that whole workshop, is responsible for that negative outcome. But they didn't make the decision. They weren't the one that changed the MC at the last minute. You see, you've got to have the authority and response. You can't be carrying the can unless you have the authority. So because the chair was responsible for the overall outcome of that, they had the power to override an individual member's legitimate decision. It was a legitimate right of that committee member to decide who the MC was. That was part of their job, but it needed to be overridden. If you override as a chair, you've got to be prepared for the consequences, which is kickback from the person you're overriding. But if you decide that that's the right thing to do and you're happy to carry the can for that, fine. And you can risk losing the committee. You can risk having to have them replaced, being set back. You can risk the out that the let's say that the committee mutinies because you override them. They may not be very cooperative with the incoming people. That can happen as well. So there are all sorts of problems when you exercise that veto. It's dangerous. So only do it sparingly. It's like the last resort. You want to achieve everything by consensus, but it is there as the last resort. Um, the next one is super contentious as well. I'm going to change my name to Susan and go and live in Tasmania after this. I think it's the only way I'll survive in AA. Um, avoidance of double-headed management. So this is an idea um, um, from the concept essays. And the idea is this: you can't serve two masters. There's a line from the book of James: a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Um, what this means in practice is if you're in service in AA, you're accountable only to one higher level. You can't be accountable in two directions at once. And the most striking example I've seen of this happening is sometimes there are conventions where the convention roves around. One year it's in this city, one year it's in another city. It's like the Olympics. Different cities bid for the convention. And this is a perfectly reasonable idea to set up a little charity, which is like the rather like the Olympic Committee, where it organizes the bid process, it sets the terms of reference for the conference. It's got a bank account to which the surplus funds of the year before are remitted so that it can provide seed finance for the following year's committee. It ensures continuity. It acts as the archive. It's a great idea. Um, uh, and there are examples of these. There are there's more than one of these. A charity based in a particular country, which is the sort of so and so AA convention charity, and they each year cities bid, they win, they host, it gets passed on. Fine, except often it'll get called the so and so AA convention. It uses the AA name in it. Now, there's only one AA. You can only call yourself AA if you're part of the structure of the country you're in, or you're subservient to the world structure of AA. I know much less about the so-called world structure of AA, but I'm given to understand it's there. But let's just keep it European. Um, let's say London wants to host this international conference. And it wants to call it this so and so AA conference. Wonderful, except local AA in Great Britain gets wind of this and says, no, 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 no. You can't call it an AA conference and hold it in Great Britain unless it's accountable to the fellowship in Great Britain. Because if you do something wrong, if it all goes pear-shaped and there's funny business with the finances, or there's a huge public argument, you don't look after the venue, and you fall out with the venue, who's going to carry the can for that? AA in Great Britain is going to be besmirched by that. Now, it's an outside possibility, but it could happen. So, fine. You either stop calling yourself AA, or you bring yourself within the scope of AA in Great Britain. So the convention will go to a region or an intergroup and say, hey, will you sponsor us? And they say, sure. So it now says sponsored by London Region South, by London Region North, by Bedford Intergroup, by Mulligatawny Intergroup. Fine. Except that can't be a rubber stamp. If it says it's sponsored or endorsed, that means the intergroup of the region has to have operational and financial oversight with the appropriate measures of censure, redirection, reorganisation and replacement. However, it can be stated in the bylaws of the charter of this roving convention that no. Who has ultimate authority over this particular, let's say, the London AA convention of so and so? Well, it's the charity which organises these conventions every year. They're the ones who are in charge of the finances. They're the ones who get the surplus funds. They're the ones with the right to direct what that convention does. Now suddenly you've got two sets of people you're accountable to. Who's going to be in charge? What if they disagree about what to do with the finances? What if something goes wrong and they disagree about what the measures are? There is no way of resolving that. And in fact, it's a live issue in London at the moment with a convention which is being funded and supported by two regions. And what they've decided, the two regions, is this convention can't be accountable to both. So the regions will take, if it's successful and it goes on for a number of years, the regions will take turns. 1 year, although both regions will be consulted, let's say London Region North will have full operational financial oversight in year 1, London Region South in year 2. London Region North in year 3, and so on. So there's only ever one line of authority and responsibility. There's only ever one body to be accountable to. If you're accountable to more than one body, there is no way of resolving the conflict between the two. One way people have tried to get round this, calling something the so-and-so AA convention, is to get letters of endorsement from service officers and intergroups and regions that say, well, we think this is a very good idea. Now, that's charming and heartwarming, but not everything that is heartwarming is good. Just because an AA convention is warmly endorsed by a service office or an intergroup, it unfortunately it means nothing. It might mean that they think that this convention has got its heart in the right place, but it stops a very, very long way short of the oversight required to ensure that AA's name is not besmirched, or that the AA is not its name is not dragged into a problematical situation. So what else have we got? So application of concept 10 in life. I've got a page on this, so I should be able to get through it. Okay, so I think this is an opinion. There we go. I'm of the opinion that those of us who are more alcoholic than we are Al-Anon tend to need sticks and carrots to be responsible. I think Bill W. uses the phrase errant children or wayward children or something somewhere in the literature. There's something coming to me. Whereas those of us who have got an Al-Anon stripe down our backs tend to be over responsible. You know who you are. You woke up thinking about things which you have no responsibility for, but you have an opinion on. But if you have trouble with being responsible, I mean, I've got a list someone gave me once of what does being responsible mean? It means being hardworking. It means being diligent. You're alert to strengths and weaknesses. You're alert to opportunities and threats. You act in a timely manner. You ask for help when necessary. You consult others where necessary. It's basically right of decision. The next element is boundaries. Um, Authority and responsibility are all about boundaries. It's about where my authority and responsibility stops and someone else's starts. I don't know if any of you have ever given any workshops to people in Al-Anon, but they're wonderful things. Everyone takes notes. Have you ever seen anyone take notes at an AA event? In America, they do. They sit there. I love them with their little leather-bound covers with the big book and the 12 and 12, the little space for your chip. You put your little chip every year, you change it over with a new chip, and you've got your pad and your pen and your highlighters. And basically, if you go to conferences or conventions in America, in the two front rows, it's full of women and gay men with their books and their highlighters and their little pads, and all the straight men are at the back looking embarrassed. But if you go to an Al-Anon thing, everyone has the highlighters, everyone has the pads, everyone has the pens and the pieces of paper. But a funny thing happens about halfway through. One person starts it, then they all start doing it. Someone says, when can I start setting boundaries with my husband? And as soon as one person asks it, everyone else wants to know, and you cannot get people back on the topic. Wherever you start, it always goes there. When can I start putting my foot down with my husband and telling him that he should stop doing this and start doing that and start doing this differently, and don't take the bait. Always suggest to people that they just go to their higher powers and ask their higher power directly. So it's just a tip for you, otherwise the whole thing will be derailed. Anyway, the notion of having boundaries. So it's about not exceeding the scope of my delegated authority in a work context. Minding my own business, not interfering with other people, not trying to undermine or circumvent established structures of responsibility and authority. Very often, people don't want to put something to the group conscience because they know they'll lose, because the group will never agree to it. So they start a WhatsApp group and they get a few people in on the WhatsApp group, and they foment discord and suspicion and all sorts of things. And if you want to exercise power in AA, do it through the proper channels. Bring it up to the group conscience. Present your view. Let go of the results. No back channels. Don't do things in all these other routes of communication. Being concerned with what lies outside the hula hoop only when it affects common welfare or something inside the hula hoop. And that's my basic principle for boundaries. And to invoke tradition 4 and concept 5 only sparingly. So to start to engage in stuff which is outside my hula hoop only when it's absolutely necessary. What else have we got? Here's a helpful phrase to me anyway. Authority without responsibility is recklessness. If I don't have to face the consequences of an action, I cannot direct it. Which means if I'm not responsible for the consequences of a decision you're making, I cannot direct how you make the decision. So even though it's kind of artificial to do this like the whole time, but you have to do it. Like when you're directing people or suggesting to people how they do an amend or whether to do an amend, say, look, you do realize the final decision must rest with you because you're the one that has to live with the consequences of having the conversation or doing whatever it is. The same with anything else, to say, this is simply my view. I may be wrong. I know my sponsor is right, actually, when he says, I may be wrong, but we know we've got high stakes when he says, we may be wrong, but. What else have we got? Responsibility without authority is powerlessness. If I'm held responsible for something that I have no control over, I push back. And you'll have situations where blame is passed around in a work situation where someone tries to give you the responsibility for a negative outcome, but you didn't have the power to avert it, either because you didn't have the decision-making authority or you didn't have the resources. And I've been taught to push back very strongly against that and not to allow the buck to be passed to me when I didn't have the authority to make the decision in the first place. Um, the list I read out earlier about scope of authority and responsibility, defining that before you take on a job, applies just as much to my personal life as it does to service. So being clear on content and deliverables and schedules and timelines and resources and so on. A couple of last points because we're just getting to the end of the hour. I'm sorry to the people who've just joined us. There was a slight snafu about a time change in Australia. No one knew, but anyway, it happened. And so we ended up being an hour earlier today. Next week we're starting, I think, well, Gabrielle will, we're starting at 10 a.m. next week, UK time. 9 a.m. next week. Okay, so next week we're going to start at 9 a.m. So the last 2 weeks on Concepts 11 and 12, it's going to be 9 a.m. UK time, which is not so great for Iowa, but I think okay for Ireland. A couple of last points. This is recorded, so, you know, if it really matters to you, we do have the recording. We will have the recording. And a couple of final points. Matching authority and responsibility when I'm looking at the world. I'm a terrible one for attributing to a whole group the features or characteristics of individuals within that group. So my step fours over the years, you know, I don't just limit my resentments to, you know, I'm you know, resentful at Andrew, and I'm resentful at Jennifer, and I'm resentful at Deirdre. I'm resentful at whole groups. I'm resentful at whole countries, and because I'm holding an entire group accountable for the actions of individuals within that group. And if you have a peep at social media or the media in general, I'm not the only person who does this. There is a lot of finger pointing at whole groups, and my personal view is this does not help. Tom W. talks about when people have resentments against the Catholic Church. Now, his question to them is, which bit of the Catholic Church? He says, you know, they don't agree amongst themselves on anything, but you're resentful against. So something terrible may have happened, but who is actually responsible for that? Blame them. Don't blame the whole thing. The same with politics, same with racial groups and so on. And as soon as I start to engage in that group thinking, either from the point of view of victim or the point of view of perpetrator, I'm not lining up authority and responsibility. And finally, this delegation of final responsibility and ultimate authority. So although God has final responsibility and ultimate authority, in practice, I mentioned this before, but it has a specific application. They say you've got to trust God. They're not wrong. But how do you know what God wants? It's important to have a sponsor you can trust. And there have been times when I've had to trust my sponsor's view on things, which means I treat my sponsor as having a degree of responsibility and authority he doesn't really have. But I treat him as having that because I trust him more than my own connection to the higher power when I am deeply disturbed about a situation or deeply involved in a situation emotionally. And I'm going to finish on this. There's a 19th century, I want to say British, I think he may have been born in Ireland, but I may be wrong on that. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, Spurgeon. All of his sermons are published. They are, I mean, they're dripping with Christian doctrine. Some preachers are very doctrinal, some are non-doctrinal. He's very doctrinal, but he's very good. If you can sift out the stuff which doesn't fit with your religious doctrine, you can get a lot out of Spurgeon. And he talks about people who are foolish enough to barricade their windows and doors against the outside world and hope to communicate with God only through a crack in the ceiling or in the top of your skull. Because if that's what you're doing, you really do have a hole in your head. Um, uh, Relying on God does not mean I cock a snook at all other human beings and assume that they're all stupid and wrong because they're not relying on God the way I am. I've got to trust the group. I've got to trust my sponsor. I've got to trust other people that give me feedback. And they stand in the stead of my higher power, as I say, in two situations: when I'm very emotionally disturbed or when I'm very invested in a situation. You pick those people carefully, but I think it's vital for long-term recovery. We've got to the hour, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening.